There are moments in life that don't look important on the surface. Nothing dramatic, no loud signal, no clear announcement that something meaningful is unfolding. Just a quiet interaction, a passing conversation, a feeling you almost ignore. And yet later, when you look back, you realize that moment carried more weight than you first understood. Not because something supernatural happened, but because something in you responded differently. That's what this is about. Not a warning, not a command. Just an observation about the kind of awareness you've been developing and how it shows up in the smallest, most unexpected situations. Because lately, you may have noticed something subtle. You don't move through the world the same way you used to. You pause more. You notice more. And sometimes, you feel things that don't logically belong to you. Not in a dramatic way. More like a quiet nudge you can't fully explain. And one of those moments might involve someone who crosses your path when you least expect it. The moment that feels small, but is. It doesn't start as anything significant. Maybe it's someone asking a simple question. Maybe it's a stranger who seems slightly out of place. Or someone you already know, but something about them feels different this time. You can't point to anything obvious. They're not saying anything alarming. They're not asking for anything direct. But something in your awareness slows down. You stop rushing through the interaction. You start paying attention in a way you didn't before. And that's where everything begins to shift. Because growth doesn't always show up as big breakthroughs. Sometimes it shows up as restraint, as presence, as the ability to recognize that not every moment should be rushed through. There was a time when you would have brushed it off. You would have stayed in your own lane, focused only on what directly involved you. But now, there's a quiet sense that some moments are worth leaning into, even if you don't fully understand why. Not because you owe anyone anything, but because you've become more aware of the impact of small actions, and how often people are carrying more than they show. When you start noticing what others miss, there's a shift that happens when you've spent enough time working on yourself. It's not loud. It's not something you announce. But internally, your awareness sharpens. You start picking up on tone, not just words. Energy, not just behavior. You notice hesitation in someone's voice. You recognize when someone is forcing a smile. You can tell when a conversation feels slightly off, even if everything sounds normal. And this isn't about being overly sensitive. It's about being present. Most people move quickly. They listen just enough to respond. They observe just enough to move on. But you've slowed down. And because of that, you catch things others don't. That's where moments like this become important. Because sometimes, the person in front of you isn't looking for a solution. They're not even looking for help in the traditional sense. They're just hopping, someone actually sees them. Not in a dramatic, emotional way. Just in a real, grounded human way. And when you're the one who notices, you have a choice. You can ignore the feeling and move on. Or you can stay a little longer in the moment. Listen a little more closely. Respond a little more thoughtfully. Not because you're responsible for fixing anything, but because presence on its own can shift something. The difference between reacting and responding. There was a time when most of your interactions were automatic. Quick responses. Surface-level conversations. Minimal engagement beyond what was necessary. And that's how most people still operate. Not because they don't care, but because they're distracted, overstimulated, constantly pulled in different directions. So they react instead of respond. But you've started to change that pattern. Now there's a gap between what happens and how you respond to it. A small pause. a moment where you actually consider what's in front of you. And in that pause, something powerful happens. You become intentional. Instead of giving default answers, you give real ones. Instead of brushing past people, you actually engage. And that shift, even though it seems small, creates a completely different kind of interaction. Because people can feel the difference. They can tell when someone is just going through the motions versus when someone is actually present. And in moments like the one we're talking about, that difference matters more than you realize. Why some encounters stay with you. Think about the last time you had a brief interaction that stayed on your mind longer than expected. Nothing dramatic happened. No major event. But something about it lingered. You replayed parts of the conversation. You thought about what you said or didn't say. And maybe you couldn't fully explain why. That's because not every meaningful moment is obvious in real time. Sometimes your mind processes it later. You start connecting small details. The way someone spoke. The way they paused. The way the interaction felt slightly heavier than usual. And that's when you realize it wasn't just a random moment. It was one of those situations where your awareness picked up on something deeper. Not in a mystical sense, but in a human sense. You recognized that there was more beneath the surface. And even if you didn't act on it fully in the moment, it stayed with you because part of you knew it mattered. That's how growth works sometimes. It doesn't always show up as immediate action. Sometimes it shows up as reflection afterward, as awareness that continues to develop, as a quiet understanding that next time, you might respond differently. The subtle responsibility of awareness. As your awareness grows, something else grows with it. Not pressure, not obligation, but a kind of quiet responsibility. Not to fix people, not to carry their problems, but to not ignore what you clearly notice. Because once you see something, you can't fully go back to not seeing it. And that changes how you move. You become more intentional with your words, more thoughtful with your presence, more aware of how even small interactions can affect someone's state. And this isn't about becoming overly serious or emotionally heavy. It's about being real, being grounded, being someone who doesn't rush past moments that deserve attention. Because sometimes, the difference between someone feeling dismissed and someone feeling understood is just a few extra seconds of presence, a slightly deeper response, a willingness to not treat every interaction as disposable. And that's where you are now. Not perfect, not always getting it right, but aware enough to know that certain moments matter, even when they don't look like they do, when someone doesn't ask for help, but still needs it. Not everyone who needs support is going to say it out loud. In fact, most people won't. They've learned how to function while carrying things quietly. They've gotten used to keeping conversations light, even when their internal world feels heavy. And if you've been paying attention lately, you've probably started to recognize this pattern. It shows up in subtle ways. A delayed response, a change in tone, a sentence that trails off before it fully lands. Nothing obvious enough to call out directly, but just enough to feel different. And this is where your awareness becomes important again. Because helping someone doesn't always mean stepping in with advice. Sometimes it's about creating a space where they don't feel rushed, where they don't feel like they have to perform or keep things surface level, where they can pause for a second and not feel like they're holding up the conversation. You're not forcing anything. You're not digging into their life. You're simply not closing the door too quickly. And that alone can shift something. Because most people are used to being met with impatience, with distraction, with half attention. So when someone actually stays present, even for a moment, it stands out more than you think. The weight people carry quietly. Everyone you interact with is managing something you can't see. Responsibilities, internal conflicts, decisions they haven't made yet, conversations they're avoiding. And over time, people get very good at hiding it. Not because they want to be fake, but because life requires them to keep moving. So they adapt. They learn how to smile when needed, how to respond when expected, how to keep things functional on the outside. But that doesn't mean the weight disappears. It just becomes less visible. And this is where your presence matters in a grounded, realistic way. You're not there to uncover everything. You're not there to analyze or diagnose. You're just aware enough to recognize when something feels heavier than it looks. And instead of brushing past it, you give it a little more space. You listen without rushing. You respond without trying to fix. You allow the moment to be what it is, without forcing it to become something else. That kind of interaction is rare. And because it's rare, it leaves an impact. Not because you did something extraordinary, but because you didn't treat the moment as disposable. The shift from me first to awareness of others. There's a stage in life where most of your focus is internal. Your goals, your struggles, your direction. And that's necessary. Everyone goes through it, but as you grow, something starts to expand. You don't lose focus on yourself, but you stop seeing everything only through your own lens. You begin to notice how your presence affects other people, how your tone can change the direction of a conversation, how your attention, or lack of it, can influence how someone feels in that moment. And this isn't about overthinking every interaction. It's about awareness, a natural shift from being completely self-focused to being aware of the space you share with others. And once that shift happens, you can't really go back. You start moving differently, speaking differently, responding differently, not because you're trying to be someone else, but because you've become more conscious of what's happening around you. And in moments like the one this video is pointing toward, that awareness becomes the difference. When you feel the urge to slow down, there's something interesting that happens in certain interactions. Time doesn't literally slow down, but your experience of it does. You become more present, more focused, more aware of the details. And in those moments, there's often a quiet internal signal. Not a voice, not a command, just a feeling. A sense that this moment deserves a little more attention than usual. And you've probably felt that before. That subtle pull to not rush, to not give a quick, automatic response, to stay engaged just a little longer. Most people ignore that feeling. They move on quickly. They stick to their routine. But you've started to notice it more. And more importantly, you've started to listen to it. Not blindly, not emotionally, but intentionally. You recognize that not every moment requires that level of attention. But when one does, you don't ignore it. And that's what makes the difference. Because those are often the moments where something meaningful can happen. Not in a dramatic, life-changing way, but in a real human way. The power of being fully present, even briefly. There's a misconception that helping someone requires time, energy, and deep involvement. And sometimes that's true. But more often than people realize, it's much simpler than that. Sometimes it's just about being fully present for a short moment. Making eye contact. Actually listening instead of waiting to respond. Answering thoughtfully instead of automatically. Not checking your phone. not mentally drifting somewhere else. Just being there, completely, even if it's only for a minute. Because most interactions today are divided. Half attention, half presence, and people feel that, even if they don't consciously think about it. So when someone gives their full attention, even briefly, it creates a completely different experience. It makes the moment feel real, grounded, genuine. And that kind of presence can shift how someone feels more than any advice ever could. Why this changes you more than it changes them. It's easy to think these moments are only about the other person, that your role is simply to show up and be present for them. But something else is happening at the same time. You're changing too. Every time you choose awareness over distraction, you reinforce that version of yourself. Every time you respond intentionally instead of automatically, you strengthen that habit. And over time, that becomes your default. You stop rushing through interactions. You stop treating people as background noise in your day. You become someone who is actually engaged with the world around you. And that shift affects everything. Your relationships, your communication, your sense of connection. Because you're no longer operating on autopilot. You're choosing how you show up. And that choice, repeated over time, becomes part of your identity. The deeper transformation happening within you. If you step back and look at your own pattern over time, you'll notice something. You're not the same person you were before. Not in a dramatic, overnight way, but in small, consistent shifts. You've become more patient, more observant, less reactive, more grounded in how you respond to things. Situations that used to pull you in emotionally now feel more manageable. Conversations that used to stay on the surface now feel more real. And it's not because the world changed. It's because you did. Your awareness expanded. Your perspective matured. And your ability to stay present improved. That's the real transformation. Not something external. Not something temporary. But a steady shift in how you experience and respond to life. And moments like the one we've been talking about, they're part of that process. They're not separate from your growth. They're evidence of it, bringing it back to the moment in front of you. So when you find yourself in one of these situations again, where something feels slightly different, slightly more meaningful than usual, you don't need to overthink it. You don't need to analyze every detail. You don't need to force yourself into action. Just do one simple thing. Don't rush it. Stay present a little longer than you normally would. Listen a little more closely. Respond a little more intentionally. That's it. Because most of the time, that's enough. Not to fix everything. Not to change someone's entire situation. But to make a moment feel real. And sometimes, that's exactly what's needed. The moments you almost walk past. There's a version of this situation that happens more often than you realize. It's the moment you almost ignore. The one where you're about to move on, about to end the conversation, about to shift your attention somewhere else. And then something in you hesitates. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make you pause. That pause is easy to override. Most people do it without thinking. They follow momentum. They continue with whatever they were already doing. But you've started to recognize that pause differently. It doesn't feel like hesitation anymore. It feels like awareness catching up to the moment. Like something in you is saying, don't rush this one. And when you listen to that, even just once, you start to see how many of these moments exist. They're everywhere. In short conversations, in passing interactions, in situations that seem completely ordinary. But the difference isn't in the moment itself. It's in whether you're present enough to notice it. When someone is holding back more than they say, you've probably seen it before. Someone starts to say something and then changes direction mid-sentence. They simplify what they were going to say. They turn something real into something casual. And if you're not paying attention, it just sounds like normal conversation. But if you are paying attention, you catch that shift. That moment where they decided not to go deeper, not to explain fully, not to be completely honest about what they were about to express. And again, this doesn't mean you need to call it out. It doesn't mean you push them to open up. But it changes how you respond. Instead of closing the conversation quickly, you leave a little space. Instead of giving a surface-level reply, you give something more real. You don't force anything. You just don't shut the door. And sometimes, that's enough for them to feel like they could say more, even if they don't right away. That's the difference. You're not creating pressure. You're creating possibility. The quiet impact of being someone who notices. Most people underestimate how rare it is to feel genuinely noticed. Not in a loud, attention-grabbing way, but in a quiet, grounded way, where someone actually registers your presence, your tone, your energy, without immediately filtering it through their own agenda. And when you become that kind of person, you start to leave an impact without trying to. Not because you're doing anything extraordinary, but because you're doing something uncommon. You're paying attention. You're not rushing to the next thing. You're not treating every interaction as something to get through. And people feel that, even if they don't consciously recognize it in the moment. It shows up later, in how they remember the interaction, in how they describe it, in how they feel about it afterward. And more importantly, it shapes how you see yourself, because you start to realize that your presence has weight, that the way you show up matters, not in a pressure-filled way, but in a grounded, real way. Why you don't need to have the perfect response. One of the biggest reasons people avoid deeper moments like this is because they feel like they need to say the right thing. They think presence requires perfect words, the right advice, the ideal response. But that's not how it works. In fact, trying too hard to say the perfect thing often creates distance. It makes the interaction feel rehearsed, less real. What actually matters is sincerity. Responding honestly, even if it's simple, even if it's not perfectly structured, even if it's just acknowledging what you're hearing. Because most of the time, people aren't looking for solutions. They're looking for connection, for someone to meet them where they are, without turning it into something else. And when you remove the pressure to be perfect, you become more natural, more grounded, more real. And that's what makes the interaction meaningful, the line between caring and carrying. As your awareness grows, there's something important you start to learn. Not every moment requires you to take something on. There's a difference between being present for someone and absorbing everything they're dealing with. And if you don't recognize that line, it's easy to cross it, to feel like you need to fix things, to feel responsible for outcomes that aren't yours. But that's not what this is about. Being aware doesn't mean becoming overwhelmed. It doesn't mean carrying other people's weight. It means recognizing what's there without taking ownership of it. You can listen without solving. You can care without overextending. You can be present without losing your own center. And that balance is part of your growth too. Because real awareness isn't just about noticing others. It's also about maintaining yourself in the process. when you realize you're not the same anymore. There's a quiet realization that happens at some point. You start noticing that your default reactions have changed. Situations that used to feel insignificant now catch your attention. Interactions that used to be automatic now feel more intentional. And the biggest shift is that you don't feel the need to rush through everything anymore. You're more comfortable in the moment, more willing to let conversations breathe, more open to where an interaction might go without forcing it. And that's not something you consciously decided overnight. It developed over time, through experience, through reflection, through small choices that slowly reshaped how you engage with the world. And now you're in a place where those changes are starting to show. Not in dramatic ways, but in consistent, grounded ones. The kind of help that does look like help. When people hear the word help, they often imagine something big. Giving advice, solving problems, taking action. But a lot of real support doesn't look like that. Sometimes it looks like attention, like patience, like not interrupting, like not rushing someone to get to the point, like responding in a way that shows you actually heard them. These things don't stand out on the surface. They don't get recognized as help in the traditional sense, but they change how someone experiences the moment. And in many cases, that's more valuable than anything else you could offer, because it gives them something they don't get often. A real interaction, one that isn't filtered, rushed, or distracted. And that kind of experience stays with people. The internal standard you've been building. What's happening here isn't random. It's the result of a standard you've been developing internally. A way of showing up that's more intentional, more aware, more grounded. And the more you act on that standard, the stronger it becomes. You don't need external validation for it. You don't need recognition. Because the shift is internal. You feel the difference in how you move, in how you respond, in how you experience everyday situations. And that becomes its own form of clarity. You're not just reacting to life anymore. You're participating in it consciously. And that changes everything. So if a moment like this shows up again, a conversation that feels slightly different, a person who seems like they're holding more than they're saying, a pause that feels worth paying attention to, you don't need to turn it into something big. You don't need to overthink your role in it. Just stay present. Let the moment unfold naturally. Respond in a way that feels real to you. Because sometimes, the smallest shift in how you show up is enough to make a moment matter. If this resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts or a moment that stayed with you recently. I'd like to hear how you've been experiencing these small shifts in your own way.